Hi everyone, today I'm going to talk about how this class has transformed my perception on higher education. It's interesting because when I started this class, I thought that a lot of the issues and challenges we have today are just recent, they're new. But in studying this class, I have learned that a lot of the issues we face are actually challenges we've had from the very beginning. So it's really been interesting and transformative for me to kind of see and to process that information. So there are a few things I'm going to talk about today, different recurring trends that I saw throughout our discussion post. So I took those and really thought about those and connected them with different discussions I hear about today. So first I'm going to talk about the American college student, who they are, who they've always been. And I've labeled that kids these days because I feel like we always talk about college students in those terms as far as generational references and how each generation has its own unique set of challenges, which they do. But we've also been talking about the American college student and challenges they face since the very beginning. I'm also going to talk a lot about money and funding. I feel like this is something that has come up quite a bit this semester, so I've called that All About the Benjamins. And I also want to talk about money in terms of cost and access for college students. This has always been an issue for us in higher education and continues to be today. I'll also talk about the American college curriculum and how it's evolved and changed, and how we continue to discuss what college students should know when they leave our institutions. I'll also talk about administration and faculty and beyond, so how our institutions are run, who's running the show, or maybe even who's sinking the ship, depending on how you want to think about that. And then finally, I'll end with missions and goals and how we are discussing who we are and what we do. We've been trying to figure that out from the beginning, and I think it's still a discussion that's relevant for today. So for kids these days, we started out with our colleges educating just the elite white male. And we, from the beginning, see this idea of the college student as being, maybe having these acts of rebellion, how maybe they've griped about bad food, how they are rallying for an evolving curriculum. So we see this kind of image of the college student pretty early on. I also noted that around the 1860s, we see a little more diversity in who the college student is. We confer some degrees for women, and HBCUs also emerge around this time. But all the way up to the 1940s, this is where I think we really envision college students as being these students who are trying to adhere to a college culture, find a way to belong. We associate college students with debauchery and fraternities and homecoming celebrations. And I think some people still see college students this way today, although I would argue that as we move to Generation Z, I think we are actually getting away from this a little bit. And then our textbook notes that around the 20th century, there's really this idea of students having trouble keeping up with academics. So for today, I think we still envision the college student as needing this place to belong and belonging to this place that holds certain traditions. And I think this can be a wonderful thing, but we certainly think about it in terms of our retention and graduation rates. And we do know that students that participate in certain college clubs or organizations, that they are more likely to graduate and make connections, and that's a wonderful thing. But at the same time, I feel like this is a challenge for our students today because we are moving away from this idea of the college student as someone who just goes to school and that's all they focus on. Instead, a lot of the students that attend, for example, my state school, they struggle with trying to belong to these organizations because they are working full-time, or they're commuter students, or they have a lot of other obligations, or maybe they're just not a traditional 18-year-old, maybe they're a non-traditional student. So I feel like this can be a challenge for our students today. Also, we do talk a lot about students having trouble when they get into our schools of keeping up with academics. And I think a lot of this started originally when we talked about students having trouble keeping up. It was because there was a lack of access to secondary education. But today we certainly have a secondary education for everyone. But at the same time, we know that secondary ed is tied to funding as well. And so a lot of our students, we feel like maybe we're just pushed through the system and now they're at our doorstep. And we are struggling also to help them keep up with college academics. And it can be really tough. College students today focus a lot on time. They want to get their degree, they want to get it fast, and then they want to tie that to a job. And so that can be really tough to do because and we'll talk about this more with the mission, but we are trying to educate students but they also want to get their degree really fast and leave and get a job. And so we can certainly understand that, but I feel like this is much more of a focus of Generation Z. They perhaps have seen their parents go through economic hardships. They have been through the housing market crisis, and they have been alive through a time of war always. So they just have a different perspective, and there's a lot of focus on finance for them, maybe as opposed to those college students that we think about a little bit more of just having a homecoming celebration. I also want to talk about money and funding for higher education, since this has come up a lot this semester. Colleges have always in America had to be resourceful from the very beginning. So unlike the Oxfords of the world who had large donations, we've always relied on smaller donations, tuition, and government funding. We've always had to be very imaginative in how we get and use our money. And in the 1900s, we start to see different forms of funding emerge, like sports as funding or large foundation donations as funding, and this idea of the corporate university model. And we continue to see money as a driving force all the way with these associations with business-like practices and the question of should colleges be run like a business. And today I think we still are focusing on that question and the fight for funding. So we know there's been a lot of government cuts, and colleges are constantly struggling with figuring out how to fund themselves and what to do with the money when we have it. One of the examples I wanted to mention about foundations and donations is my school's MTSU's Political Economy Research Institute and the controversy recently surrounding that. So we have this institute, and a lot of people aren't very happy about it because the funding comes from the Koch brothers foundation. And so the question then becomes, what do we do? We want this money, we need this money, and there's this constant battle for more, but at the same time, we have to look at who it's tied to or what it's tied to, and then questions arise such as what are our obligations when we take money from certain sources, and what does that mean in terms of academic freedoms and the things that we're connected to? So I think that's a perfect example about how colleges have constantly had this battle between needing the funding and then trying to figure out what to do in terms of sources for funding. I also want to talk about colleges in terms of cost and access for students. So we know that colleges started as education for the elite, and around the mid-1900s we see big changes. So we see more access to higher education. We see the beginnings of standardized testing and selective admissions. World War II brings along the GI Bill, which dramatically changes access to higher education. And then in the late 1900s, it's the Pell Grant era, which also continued to expand access to education. So the good news is that we have continued to transition from education for the elite to mass higher education. So that's a wonderful thing. But along with that certainly comes a lot of challenges. So for today, access is still a problem. We still rely mostly on standardized testing, although some people would argue that's changing for access. And we know that wealthier students have more academic resources, and therefore they are more likely to do better on standardized tests, which don't necessarily measure anything but sort of this achievement of you can study it and get better. And so the students that have access to that are able to get into more elite schools and get better funding and scholarships. Student loan debt is probably one of the biggest issues we face as the cost of college continues to rise, and students are graduating with more debt, but they're not necessarily landing in a good financial position. The economy is tough. Maybe they're getting jobs that aren't paying as much as they thought that they would. And so the question then becomes, is college still worth it? And I think it is, but I feel like this is something that we have to address if we want to kind of argue that, because we don't want our students graduating with all of the student loan debt and not really maybe seeing the value of their education if that's all they're tying it to is their job. And if they're not getting the job they want, then they may question that. All right, let's talk a little bit about curriculum, or what students should know. So we've constantly evolved with curriculum. We started with this traditional classical liberal arts model, but even as early as the 1800s, we started expanding into other areas like medicine and law. And we continue to diversify our disciplines of study in the 1800s. We have advanced technical education, lots of different institutes emerged like normal schools. And then once again in the mid-1900s, presidents start tying certain fields to money. And so whatever was more lucrative is what they pushed. And I feel like that's maybe still impacts us today. For today, though, as far as our curriculum goes, I think we will continue to focus more on interdisciplinary connections and majors. I feel like students will want more internships and field experiences because they want to network and they want to be able to have those connections when they leave. I also think that we'll continue to push for STEM education while simultaneously the arts will try to argue that students need critical thinking and problem solving skills. And I think that might be a really great way to merge these two because sure, we want people to have business degrees, but at the same time, there's this argument that sometimes students in some of these majors aren't getting those critical thinking, problem solving skills. So perhaps we can merge those two and get some really nice interdisciplinary connections where our students will benefit. I also hope that colleges will continue to help students work towards jobs of the future. So I think one of the frustrations for students is that maybe they're going to college and they think that by the time they graduate, they'll just land this job. Well, that job may not exist 5 to 10 years from now. So we have to focus on skills and we have to focus on jobs of tomorrow, and that will also benefit our students. Okay, so let's take a look at who's running the show. So from the very beginning, we've been very unique because we've always had an external review board and a strong central administration with a powerful president. That's been our model, and it was unique from the beginning, and it's served us well, although we certainly have some issues. So just a little bit about the different types of institutions and how we've run the show. Around the 1800s, we see more types of institutions emerge. And there's a lot of changes going on in the mid-1900s. So board members are business executives. This is where junior colleges really emerge. We see powerful business-savvy presidents and new positions for both administrative staff and faculty alike, with things like advisors and department chairs emerging. And faculty are still very traditional at this point. They're still sage on the stage. In a short period of time, though, we go from a shortage of faculty in fields to the faculty job market drying up, which is a really interesting change. So here's a few things about today that I'm considering as far as who's running the show. I think we have some power shifts and dynamics going on. Thalen talks about how we have really powerful boards now and how that's even trumping our university presidents, and there's not a lot of checks and balances there. And I continue to see this to be an issue until we kind of figure out how to have some checks and balances with our system. We also see athletics as still being very powerful too, which is really interesting. One of the issues that people bring up today is the idea of administrative bloat. But I think as colleges grow in what we do and what we offer, we have to have these positions. The problem becomes, though, the funding that's tied to that and the need to pay all these positions, and that a lot of the administration positions are paid a lot of money. And so there's this issue again with tied back to funding, right? Another issue as far as funding goes tied to faculty is that we do still have this faculty job market that's been dried up. And so we have a lot of adjunct faculty who are not really getting paid what maybe that they want if they want a full-time career. And it's still really overly saturated at this point. So finally, let's talk about our missions and goals, who we are, what we do. We started out as shaping men into these responsible public servants. They didn't need those degrees. They were wealthy. They were just there to become leaders, right? But today, our mission, we want to retain students and graduate students. That's what colleges and the government are focused on. Students are wanting to get credentialed and they want to get a job. And it's really tough figuring all this out in the new global economy. But one quote I really liked from the text was, "As students change, colleges must follow." And I absolutely think that's true. Sometimes we're really slow to respond. We need to really adjust to these new modes of learning, like online learning, because if we don't, for-profit colleges will certainly win that battle. And they are often speaking to our neglected students that are maybe poor performing, or non-traditional students who already have jobs but are looking to move up in their fields. So we have to adjust and adapt to what students need. We have to, whether we like it or not, focus on not only helping them become excellent citizens and to be informed and smart, but also to help them gain employment. And we got to do it in a really timely manner. So thank you for listening today. A lot of really interesting things I've learned in this class, and I've enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.